I have 1 minute left. One last point. The housing bubble was not caused by government deregulation. The fact is, free market economies, inherently, they always create manias and bubbles. What made this one different and what made this one so much worse is that every single instrument of government policy was used to inflate it. From the Community Reinvestment Act to Fannie and Freddie Mae between 2005 and 2007 bought up $1 trillion of subprime mortgages. That sent the signal that the U.S. government was in effect standing behind these things. It undermined underwriting standards across the country. And the biggest mistake that was made and that was responsible for this crisis was by a regulator named Alan Greenspan, who kept interest rates too low for too long, flooded the system with credit, and when a system is flooded that way with credit, it inherently is going to get misallocated, and it got misallocated into the housing system. Thank you very much.
Katrina, you have 5 minutes.
The nation the nation has never opposed increasing the deficit if you are investing in the country's education, its public infrastructure, its productive capacities, its human capital. What the Bush administration bequeathed this administration was a cynical deficit, one that was run up because of disastrous wars, which didn't make us more secure, because of tax cuts for the very rich. And that is a wasteful deficit. But in terms of building a new social contract in this country, one which does invest in people and in a country which is literally in parts falling apart, you do need deficit spending. And that has been the history and the experience of countries around this world at different times. The misuse and abuse of history, the fight over the New Deal and how we came out of the Depression is one that the right has invested an enormous amount of energy in because it speaks directly to the importance of the role of government and the importance of a government that is spending in ways that we haven't seen again in decades. But unemployment dropped between 1933 and 1936 from 25% to about 10%. Industrial production in this country doubled between 1933 and 1936. And that spending, that funding, laid the groundwork for this country's ability to then move into World War II, which was essentially Keynesianism on steroids. One of the great values of the New Deal was social insurance, Social Security, the greatest anti-poverty program in this country, one that the right has tried to privatize and destroy, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. If we didn't have that stabilizing buffer today, we would be in far more trouble. In terms of the housing crisis, it was directly linked to a deregulatory frenzy that both parties were complicit in. When Glass-Steagall, a New Deal piece of legislation which separated commercial and investment banking, was repealed, in the Clinton administration, it led to the creation of what we are now calling toxic assets, the securitization of mortgages, the packaging of mortgages, which has created bubbles, and the cynicism to then blame the Community Reinvestment Act, which essentially protected low-income, poor people in this country from being preyed on by predatory lenders who would have been unleashed far more viciously without that act, is something that has become one of these urban myths. I'd end by saying that Rich mentioned Alan Greenspan. It's been interesting to see the fortunes of Alan Greenspan fall so precipitously. He was the oracle of our time at a certain moment. But it's interesting that Alan Greenspan, to come back to perhaps an agreement with Rich on the banking front, not on letting industries, on letting manufacturing, on letting people fall through the net into joblessness and despair. But Alan Greenspan himself, about a month ago, said that banks in this country, many of them, may have to go into what he called conservatorship, receivership, another word for short-term nationalization. And I think that is an idea that needs to be continued to be pushed on the agenda because, as I said earlier, the banking bailout right now is too sweet for bankers. It is nationalizing the risk and privatizing the profits. And we need to reverse that. And I do think that this administration is smart enough to understand if Plan A doesn't work, turn to a Plan B, and the stress test they're doing with banks now is moving in that direction. Last point, again, there is no cynicism in using a crisis to rebuild a financial and banking sector that is smaller, more regulated, more regional, more democratic, more boring. Plain vanilla banking is something we could all use going back to instead of all of these toxic assets and instruments bedeviling our economy.
Thank you both for your spirited answers. You'll have a chance to return to economic issues during the question and answer period from the audience following the formal part of the debate. But now let's turn to our second topic. Resolved, President Barack Obama's national security policy represents a fundamental break with President Bush's, and thus will make us safer. Katrina, you have 10 minutes.
You know, it's going to take us years to undo the damage of the last 8 years we've lived through. In some ways, what President Obama is doing is restoring the United States to a bipartisan foreign policy that even George W. Bush's father held to, an end to preemptive war, an end to torture. When Barack Obama became president-elect, he told us that the true strength of our nation comes not from the might of our arms or the scale of our wealth, but from the enduring power of our ideals, democracy, liberty, opportunity, and unyielding hope. He promised to return to an America and a foreign policy consistent with America's traditional values and wants, and to partner with moderates in the Islamic world. That is a break. Another break is that Obama is governing as a peacetime president, not a war president. I can't argue here tonight that there are fundamental breaks with President Bush's foreign policy, but there are breaks, and there are continuities. But let me just come back to the fact that as a peacetime president, it is the domestic priorities like the economy and energy that are consciously given equal, if not greater weight, than what one might call the militaristic security concerns that have so governed this country's foreign policy in these last years. And I believe this is a significant shift. For example, Iraq. It is no longer a war underway, but one which is now being ended. It has stretched our military to the breaking point. It has looted our treasury. It has led thousands to despair. There is now a respect for smart diplomacy, for non-military resolutions to conflicts, and there's a belief in engaging adversaries. It's easy to engage friends and allies. It's tougher and smarter to engage adversaries.